Let's discuss the number one pre-flop mistake that new poker players make, both in cash games and tournaments, live and online. I want to be sure you do not make this blunder because it will make it very difficult for you to win at poker. Yet, if you look at most small stakes games, tons of players do this, which is why they lose. I don't want to teach you to win. Recognize that if you want to start winning more at small stakes poker, you must focus on your preflop play first. Preflop play is tricky though because it doesn't really feel that difficult, and a lot of people think it's unimportant. But in reality, it's the most important part of the game because you make a preflop decision every single time you are dealt into the hand. Bad preflop play will result in bad postflop play, and it will be difficult for you to have a positive win rate if you start with ranges that are usually, as most people do, way too wide and often way too weak. The number one pre-flop mistake that most new poker players make is that they limp in. They just call the big blind. If you want to win at small stakes games, you must stop limping immediately. This is especially the case if you are the first person to enter the pot. If you are the first person to enter the pot, meaning they fold to you and you have to decide if you should fold, limp, or raise, your only options should be fold or raise. Calling the big blind, putting in just one big blind, is not a viable option. You have to stop trying to trick your opponents with pocket aces or trying to see a cheap flop with a hand like pocket threes. The main reason for this is that you're going to have a tough time playing a big pot when you happen to make a premium hand because the pot's going to be so small. Also, if you're playing in a game where there's a rake, you guarantee you pay the rake by limping. Whereas if you just raise and pick up the pot pre-flop, very often you don't pay a rake or the rake is minimal. And if you do raise and someone calls, the pot becomes big so that the rake is getting closer to the capped amount taken anyway. There are tons of reasons why limping is bad, but I'm going to focus today on the top three reasons why you should stop limping immediately. And if you have a friend who often limps, send them this video. It will change their poker career forever. Before we move forward, do me a favor, click the like button, click the subscribe button, click the notification bell. Let's get right to it. Limping very often telegraphs weakness. Most players will see a limp as weak because there are a lot of potential marginal offsuit combinations of hands and junky suited hands that you could reasonably limp. For example, when most players limp in, they limp in with small pairs, suited connectors, weak high card hands, maybe suited aces, maybe suited kings, etc. They usually don't limp in with their best hands. They don't limp in with aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, nines, eights, ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack, king, queen, right? So when you limp with that weak range, it puts a target on your back for your opponents to raise or make isolation plays. It essentially splits your range very early in the hand and lets your opponents know when you limp that you probably don't have a very good hand. And showing that you have multiple range types early in the pot is very detrimental because if you limp and your opponents know that is generally marginal or weak, they can just raise all their best hands and absolutely crush you. And when they don't have one of their best hands, but a reasonable hand, they can just limp behind and not put in all that much more money. Instead, you want to raise or fold with everything. That way your opponent won't know if you have a really good hand or a playable but marginal hand. You may say, but what if I limp with aces and kings and queens? That way I can limp with a wider range, right? Because then I'm a little bit more protected. While that is potentially true, the problem is you really don't want to limp in with aces, kings, and queens and play a six-way limped pot. That's a disaster. You want to play big pots with your big hands, and you do that by raising and putting money in the pot. Limping also takes away your initiative. When you limp preflop, you don't really take control of the hand, which is going to make it harder for you to win postflop unless you just actually make the best hand. For example, if you raise before the flop with 6-5 suited and the big blind calls and it comes ace, king, queen, and they check and you bet and they don't have anything, they're going to fold. But whatever they hand whatever hand they had was probably way better than your 6 high, right? Being the preflop aggressor gives you the ability to often continuation bet and win the pot when both players have nothing. You also miss out on just basic preflop fold equity. When you raise before the flop, you can win the pot immediately when everyone folds, which is actually a huge win for the bottom portion of your open raising range. When you raise with a 6-5 suited and everybody folds, that's fantastic because you just won 1.5 big blinds with 6 high. That's a good success. Recognize we're not thinking about how to play only specific hands. We're considering how to play our entire range, right? As I stated just a second ago, having initiative allows you to continuation bet often, but also keep betting on the turn and generally showing strength. And this is going to result in you winning the pot even when you do not have the best hand. If you limp, though, this becomes far more difficult to do because limping also leads to way too many multi-way pots. Whenever you play multi-way, you essentially have to make a decent hand to win. And while multi-way pots are unavoidable to some extent in the small stakes games where a lot of people like to call raises, you want to have a strong, uncapped range, meaning you want to be able to have pocket aces and kings and queens and whatnot in your range. But when you limp, it makes your range generally weak. And if your range is generally weak, you just don't get to bet all that often in multi-way pots. If you constantly limp in and play multi-way pots with very marginal hands, you're going to end up winning small pots and losing large ones because these spots are going to be very difficult to navigate because whenever you see a 7-way pot, someone's probably going to have something. And if it's not you, it's probably someone else, and it's hard to have a really good hand just in general, right? You're also going to find that the idea of trying to see a cheap flop and make a good hand doesn't really work out as well as you might expect because assuming your opponents are anywhere near decent at poker, they're going to fight far less hard in multi-way pots because they realize that someone's likely to have something. So when you do make a premium hand like a set or a straight, you're going to rarely get paid off compared to raise pots where your opponents can more reasonably put you on a bluff because very often the pot's going to be heads up or two ways. By the way, if you do raise and 7 people call your raise, yeah, you're going to have to make a good hand to win that pot most of the time. And that's okay. But limping leads to that scenario far more often. Let's take a look at some game theory optimal preflop opening ranges. These ranges and a whole lot more can be found at peakgto.com. Here is your strategy from the low jack seat, which is first to act if there are 6 players at the table. If there are more players at the table, like 9, you would play even tighter. Take a look at what is raising in red and what is folding in blue. Very notably, the hands that are folding in blue are a lot of junky suited connectors like 8-6 suited, 7-5 suited, 6-4 suited, 4-3 suited. The smallest pairs, 4s, 3s, and 2s, are folding. And then a lot of offsuit hands that a lot of people think are decent are folding, like Queen Jack, King 10, Queen 10, Jack 10, Ace 9, and all the other offsuit stuff. You only get to raise about 15% of hands from the low jack seat. And this may seem or feel very, very tight to you because a lot of players in the small stakes games raise the Queen 9 offsuit, 9-8 offsuit, 8-5 suited, 4-3 suited. And they're torching their money because they're out of position against multiple players yet to act. Or what a lot of these players do is they limp all of the hands that are kind of on the cusp of playability, like Queen 8 suited, 10-8 suited, 9-7 suited, 8-6 suited, 4-3 suited, pocket 2s, pocket 3s, Jack 10 offsuit, 10-9 offsuit, Ace 9 offsuit, etc. And that makes their limping range very, very weak, like we discussed. Imagine you just raise all these hands in red and then limp all those hands that are on the cusp of playability, where your limping range is quite marginal. And like I said, that's going to make you very, very prone to getting exploited. You may say, what if I just limp the bottom portion of this range? Maybe I limp the Ace 2 suited and the Ace 3 suited and King 7 suited and 10-9 suited and pocket 6s and King Jack offsuit and Ace 10 offsuit. Same story, that range is still pretty weak. It does not contain aces, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack, etc. And that's going to make your raising range a little bit too strong because now it doesn't have the bottom portion of this raising range, right? And it also makes the limping range, again, quite weak, and that is detrimental. Instead, when they fold to you, raise. Next, what should you do from the button if everyone folds around to you? This is a spot where you now get to play about 40% of hands. Now, if the players in the blinds are a little bit too tight, or you think they're going to fold a little bit too often on the flop and turn and river, you can actually raise a little bit wider than this. If you think they're not going to re-raise often enough from the blinds, you can also raise a little bit wider than this. But what you should not do is limp in with a bunch of junk, like 8 king 6 offsuit, queen 7 offsuit, 8 7 offsuit, 8 5 suited, 6 3 suited, 4 3 suited. If you want to try to exploit your tight passive opponents, you do that by raising with a wider range, not by limping with the marginal stuff, just hoping to flop well. This is especially bad from the button because whenever you raise from the button, you're only against 2 players. You're going to steal the blinds a lot. And stealing the blinds with the vast majority of this offsuit stuff and a lot of the junky suited stuff is a very big success. So that's it for today. If you enjoyed today's video, click the like button, click the subscribe button, click the notification bell. To recap, you must stop leaking your chips by limping. Limping, Telegraphs weakness. It gives up your initiative, and it leads to many multi-way pots with marginal hands, which is exactly where you do not want to be. So instead, focus on playing a good, strong, robust, raise first in strategy, where you build pots with your best hands, which is exactly what you want to do. You gain fold equity, which is what you want with the weaker portion of your range. And you isolate the blinds, so you get to play more heads-up pots where you can just push your opponents around and win a lot of the pots where both players have nothing. And you just generally take the initiative and control your own fate more than actually having to flop a hand 7 ways and hope somebody pays you off. Good luck in your games. Have fun. Stop limping. And I'll talk to you next time.